Welcome. You're listening to a 2019 Right on Con podcast. This is Sue Stanley from the Right on Con team. I'm thrilled to chat today with young adult author Sarah Enni about Long Roads to Publication. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
For those of you who may not know, Sarah is the author of the young adult novel Tell Me Everything, which is coming out on February 26th. Very exciting. Less than a
Yay.
month to go for you. This year, obviously, from Scholastic, and a short story in the New York Times bestselling anthology, Because You Love to Hate Me. She is also the creator and host of the First Draft podcast. So, Sarah, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, everything you just said is correct. I've been writing young adult books for about 10 years. And for about 4 of those years, I've also been doing the First Draft podcast where I interview other writers. Mostly it has been young adult to this point. A whole lot of people like Lee Bardugo, Veronica Roth, Victoria Aveyard, the whole bunch, and learning a lot about writing as I've been going on the journey myself. I started writing in Washington, D.C., but have moved to Los Angeles where I live with my cat.
It's a nice, warm place to live. Much warmer
Yeah.
this week, especially than Washington, D.C.
Oh, yes, very much.
So you mentioned your publishing journey that you've been writing for 10 years, and our topic today is the long road to publication. So
Mhm.
can you tell us about that journey, your personal journey to publication?
Yeah, honestly, in preparation for this interview, I made a publishing timeline, like a Google Doc, where I went through all of my emails. I went to the Internet Archive to go through my blog posts. I started a blog in 2009, and I was going through like my posts in 2010. Boy, I gotta tell you, I don't recommend that. It was a really kind of tough to go back all the way back into to track that, both because it's a long time and because it was a really personal journey that was kind of marked by the progress of a life. So I'll just start with basically I started writing in 2009 in the wake of my dad passing away. He died suddenly in December 2008, and at the time I was a journalist and I was studying English. And had always kind of thought about writing. I knew I was a strong writer and I loved books, but I never thought about being an author. When my dad died, I kind of had a reckoning about what I was doing and decided that I wanted to give it a try, if not now, when. So I started writing my very first book in January 2009. I finished that in about a year, and it was just an epic, sprawling, wild, I think a lot of people with their first books kind of bite off more than they can chew, and that was certainly the case with me. But it taught me how to write a book, and it taught me how to finish a book, which is a very important lesson. And so then in 2010, I started writing, I guess, quote unquote, real books, books that had more of a legitimate chance of being published. And I pursued traditional publication. And since then, I've written 7 books. Um, and it just took a long time. I got an agent in 2013, who is still my agent today, Sarah Burns at the Gurnett Company, and she's wonderful and she's been hugely supportive, even though since 2013, it took a long time for my debut book, Tell Me Everything, to come about. So again, honestly, making this publishing timeline right before talking to you was it kind of threw me for a loop because I'm not someone that looks back very often. When I think about it on a larger scale, spending 10 years writing 7 books, it was worth that time. I think I was basically doing an apprenticeship for myself. I read so much. I made so many writer friends. I started the podcast. I just needed that time to kind of gestate and become a better writer. And I couldn't be more thrilled to have Tell Me Everything be the book that is my first book. I'm extremely proud of it. And I absolutely could not have written Tell Me Everything any sooner. I think that it is the best book I could write right now. And I'm really proud of that.
So Tell Me Everything is the 7th book you wrote, or does it
Yes.
fall earlier? It is the 7th book that you wrote.
Yes.
Is that the one that got representation in 2013, or was there something else that got representation in 2013?
It was something else. It was the 3rd book that I wrote, which is colloquially, or to me and my friends, called Bright Lights at this point. My agent was and is so supportive of that, and I'm actually rewriting that project right now, which is exciting. So those 7 books haven't gone away. There's a couple that I would like to revisit and possibly seek publication for. But no, the book that got me my agent is not the book that is not Tell Me Everything. And actually, Bright Lights, the book that got me my agent. It went all the way to acquisitions. So it went to an editor who was hugely supportive of it in her house. She was so excited, brought it to acquisitions, and her publisher told her no. So it was a really tough moment. It got very far, but ultimately came up short. And in the wake of that disappointment is when I started the First Draft podcast, because I was really looking to other writers to say, like, hey, have you been through this experience? What have you learned? What's good advice you have? Like, can I get inspired by you? And it was really inspiring. I talked to a lot of authors through that about their own long publishing journeys, and I found it to be really helpful and kind of motivating me to keep going.
That must have been awful.
It was
I,
intense. It was intense. The worst part was that happened in March. I got the call saying, unfortunately, no. And then a couple months later, I got divorced. So that was another thing that added to starting the podcast. So, like I
what a
said,
great year.
going
What a
back through
great
this,
year of new beginnings.
you know what, 2014 was a real time for me personally, but which again contributes to going back and talking about a publishing journey, a long publishing journey. You really can't separate that from your personal journey. You know, we can't separate writing from ourselves personally in any way. I don't think we should even try to. But looking back over the last 10 years, yeah, it's a lot of trials, but all of those things made me a better writer.
Okay, that's so after that story, what is the most important piece? This question seems really cliched, but what is the most important piece of advice or guidance that you can give to an author just starting their publication journey?
Yeah. Well, a couple things, and you sent me a few questions ahead of time that I had time to look at, and they're such good ones. So I'm really excited to chat about these. And when I was thinking about the most important piece of advice, I really am thinking about having patience, not only with the publishing process, which, as we all know, is very convoluted and takes time, and it's completely out of our control, a lot of elements of it, but also have patience with yourself. A lot of people start writing and get very excited about the idea of being published, and that is exciting and it's worth working towards passionately. But you also need to take time to reflect on your writing. You know, writing a good book takes time, letting it rest takes time, revising it takes time, and all those elements, you just can't rush them if you want to do your best work. So patience is a huge thing. And I was thinking about being curious. I think that's my advice to almost everybody in life in general. Be curious. And in this context, what I mean is be curious about writing, read books about writing, read widely in the genre that you are writing in, read widely in general, be curious about your industry, learn about how it works, learn about how people get paid, learn about how people make a sustainable living, learn about everybody that goes into the process of making a book happen, because it's not just editors. There's a lot of people that go through the process of bringing your book into the world, and learn about your coworkers. Be curious about other writers. Be curious about their process. Be curious about their lives and how they care for themselves. I think curiosity is an undervalued trait, and it's something that got me through absolutely.
And that's great advice. Actually, very good advice. So, this is obviously in your opinion or in your experience. What do you think it is that causes some publishing journeys to be short, sweet, fast, and others to take a long time?
This is such an interesting question, because the true answer is like a big old shrug emoji, like serendipity, zeitgeist. You know, there are you absolutely cannot know what your publishing journey is going to be, and it is not reflective of how hard you work, or sometimes even the quality of your words. There and I'm saying this as an effort to say, don't blame yourself. If it takes a long time, it takes a long time. And that can be a gift, honestly. If I had published anything before Tell Me Everything, I think I'd be embarrassed by the book that was out in the world. So I'm very grateful that it took this long, because I just needed to be a better writer. But going back to your question, what takes so long? Let's be honest about what some things are. Some things are writing goals. Some people just want to write for fun. And if that's how you start, then you're probably not going to write as fast or in the same way as someone who really is focused on publication. So your goals obviously shape your journey to publication. what type of fiction. You might write faster if you're looking to self-publish or to put things out in the world in that way, or maybe short stories versus novels. So your goals for what kinds of thing you want to write will also determine your journey and people's time, your personal time. What else do you have going on in your life? What is your style of writing? Do you slowly piece together sentences, or are you someone who fast drafts and just wants to vomit something out and then get a lot of feedback on it? All of those things are going to determine how long it takes for you, but there are also things that you can't or shouldn't or should be hesitant to change, because I think everyone needs to respect their personal process. Once you find what works for you, if it takes a long time, that's just what it is. And you should settle in and make peace with that so that you have a happy time when you are writing. And then, yes, zeitgeist, trends, serendipity, there are just things you can't control. And it takes time to find the right agent for you. It takes time to find the right editor for you and the right publishing house for you and the right story for you. Um, Sometimes we want to write vampires and the world is sick of vampires. So we can't control that. I still think you should write what you're passionate about, but the world doesn't always agree with us.
So let's talk about a very simple question. Define long.
You know, sorry, motorcycles. This is a good question, but I'm not sure that it's really useful to define long. I don't know that thinking about it that way is entirely useful, because it depends on the person, and it depends on how they have thought about the time that they've spent pursuing publication and what you were able to achieve in that time. For example, I would certainly look back on my 10 years and say that that was a long time, but it also was a time that I moved, I got married and divorced, I grieved, I relocated my life. I got a cat, I started the podcast. I changed careers. I did a lot of things in that 10 years that so it is a long time, but it was a productive, useful, wonderful time. So I don't have a metric. I think we can certainly say that short is anything less than a year. And beyond that, it's kind of up to you and your perspective.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. I think the reason I asked the question is because I was thinking about authors coming in with an expectation that they're going to write a book. They're going to do, like Ramo or something in November, and they're going to put out a book, and they're going to get an editor in a month after that, and they're going to have a publishing contract a month after that. And if you are a new writer, that might be an expectation, when in reality that does not happen. I mean, I guess it could. It's probably happened to a few people, but
it's very unlikely, right? Like, I would say if someone started writing, if someone on day one said, okay, I'm going to write seriously, if they published a book within 5 years, I would be incredibly impressed. That is just not common. And that's okay. It's hard to tell someone who's just a starting writer that, but honestly, that's the way it goes, because I signed the contract for Tell Me Everything in May 2016, and it comes out in February 2019. We did have to delay it a little bit because I had to burn down a couple drafts and start all over again, but it also isn't that unusual.
Right. And I think people don't, if they haven't been in the publishing industry, they don't necessarily realize how long it is. Just even when the editing process is done and the book is ready to go, how long it takes to actually get it into production and get it out into the stores.
Man. So long. Friends who aren't in the publishing industry have been asking me, isn't your book already out? And I was like, no, it just sold 3 years ago. Like, it's just, now there's a date on a calendar and we just have to wait.
Yeah. It's an exciting wait though. And you're almost through it. You are almost done.
My God. Now I finally can, send all my friends an email being like, here's the book. It's real. Buy it on this day.
Now go buy it.
Yes, exactly.
At this time, on this date, from this venue, please. Okay. And you've talked about this a little bit, but what did you do to keep your morale up during this long process, this 10 years, especially, I would think, between the 2013 or 2014, when your book did not get picked up after having an editor, to when you actually did sign and that you knew that it was actually going to happen for you? How did you keep your morale up during that time?
Yeah. This is a really good question, and it's gonna be different for everybody, but for me, making friends with other writers was and has been a pivotal thing in my life. I joined Twitter in 2009, and I met an enormous number of other young adult writers, and those, largely women, have contributed to my life in innumerable ways. They've completely reshaped me as a person. They shared my passions, they shared my interests, they were supportive at all times, and they got to know this nascent part of me, this writer part of me that still other people who are in my life in other capacities don't totally understand. So finding writer friends, people who are there in the trenches with you is unbelievably important, and they are the ones that will understand the ups and downs of this industry the way no one can. My mom doesn't need to know what sub-right drama is going on in my that isn't something that you need other people in your life to know or care about. In fact, you should have non-writer friends too who can put things in perspective. But your writer friends are the ones who are going to say, "No, you need to write this book because I want to read it. Like, I don't care what happens with it eventually, but what you've shared is so good. I really want you to finish this draft." That's hugely important. And then I think the other thing that kept my morale up was pursuing hobbies and activities outside of writing. Having the podcast, even though we talk about writing a bunch, it's really just an excuse to have fun conversations with people and to learn, as you know, learning how to put a podcast together. Very cool, very not
Hmm.
related to books, very challenging. Involves a bunch of cool equipment and stuff like that. And so I really enjoyed having that kind of on the side. I exercise a bunch. I started boxing, just things like that that were like very separate. I've been doing improv for the last year. It works my creative brain, but wow, it couldn't be more different from writing a book. So those things are huge. And the last thing that I'm going to say that is also incredibly important, what kept my morale up was that I was writing books I was proud of. I wanted to go back to those books because they meant something to me. And I was interested in the ideas that I was exploring through those books, and that's what kept me passionate about going back to the projects and writing them over and over again. I saw myself improve because I was committed to it, and when you when you take a month off of a book and you go back and read it and you're like, "Wow, this is not crap." That is a really heartening moment, and those moments really, really would buoy me for a long time.
That's great. And taking
Yeah.
the break is a really good idea too. Sometimes it
Oh
takes
gosh.
that to realize that you are writing something that's worthwhile.
Yes, and honestly, a month minimum. Like, the longer you can take away from your book, the better you're gonna be at tackling the problems it has when you finally get back to it. Take that seriously, please.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So
Mhm,
your experience is not this one, but I know you talk to a lot of different authors. So
mhm.
I'm wondering if you have any insight into what happens when an author winds up going through, say, multiple agents, where a project that an agent picks up doesn't sell, the relationship begins to deteriorate over time because it's not selling or because the fit isn't right. And the same with an editor. You had that experience where
Mm.
the editorial relationship had to end, not because of the editor, but because of the publishing house. So, when do you think it's time to move on? Like, when do you know, or what can you recommend for making that kind of a difficult decision about moving on from an agent or an editor?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is, like you said, it's a very difficult decision. Let's talk about agents first because they're so personal. When you have an agent, that you are in a relationship with that person. This isn't all true for all industries that have agents. I actually know people in Los Angeles who have an agent for film or television, and that relationship is very different. But for us in books, your agent is your advocate. They are someone who is the person, your first point of contact, the person who's there to support you and to encourage you and to help you achieve your goals. And I would say that if you are in that kind of a relationship and your needs aren't being met, then you need to be very serious about whether that is the right relationship for you. Like a romantic relationship, an agent has to cater to your specific needs. And if that isn't happening, you need to have a really serious conversation with your agent about what your needs are, communicate what you want to see and how they can improve. And if things don't change, I think then you have to move on and move on with gratitude and not a sense of loss. I think people really beat themselves up over lost time, and that isn't I just wish I wish I could erase that, because that creates that prevent doing from making good, bold, necessary changes in your life, including leaving an agent that is just not meeting your needs and is just not right for you. There's a lot of agents out there now. They're all online. You can research them. You can find a lot of people who are going to be great for you. So that's what I would say. If your needs aren't being met and after a serious discussion, they don't change and adjust to meet your needs, then yeah, you need to move on. An editor is kind of a whole different barrel of worms, or whatever the idiom I'm looking for is. Uh, a, an editor, once you sell to an editor, that's it. And if you are having trouble with them, that's when you need an agent who is going to step in and help things work smoothly and adjust. Um, but editors, like, when before you sell your book, often you'll get the chance to hop on a phone with an editor. That's huge. Get on the phone with them. Don't be shy. Don't let a fear of being on the phone prevent you from having that kind of intimate conversation with someone before you sign on to work with them with your precious book. You want to hear their voice. You want to hear their enthusiasm. You want to get the sense of their ideas and see if you guys are going to be a good match, because that's another year and a half or 2 years of your life of working with this person on something very important to you. So protect yourself up front and get a sense that this is a person you want to work with. And then if it isn't working, have your agent step in. Those are really tough relationships, but it's hard to say pick up and leave an editor. That's a challenge, because then you can sell another project maybe elsewhere or other things like that, but that's when contracts get involved. So it's very case by case basis kind of stuff.
What I was thinking of, that's true. And once you're under contract, I think you're just going to have to suck it up and deal with
Right.
whoever it is that you have,
Right.
and hopefully that works really well. What I was
Mhm.
thinking about when I wrote that question was really had to do with the revise and resubmit
Oh,
requests.
yes, right.
So when you are working with an editor and they're saying, "Okay, do this and then I'll read it again, and then do this and I'll read it again," when is
Mhm.
it time to say, no, I'm not going to revise anymore because I don't believe that you're actually going to come through with a contract? This is just taking a lot of my time and I'm not sure that it's going to work.
Yes, yes, such an important distinction. Um, and I think it's so important to emphasize that when you're talking about revising and resubmitting for an editor, please keep in mind that is free work. They are asking you to take a lot of time and energy, and apply changes, without paying you first, without giving you an advance. So that's something to really keep in mind. Is it worth it for you? Um, Also, it depends on their notes. If you get notes from an R&R note from an editor, if those notes feel off to you or like not the right thing for the book, that's right there your sign. I think walk away, just be at peace and leave and find another opportunity. If you're excited by their notes, if you think they really get the book and you want to implement those changes, by all means do it. I had this experience, and when they came back and asked me for a second pass of revision, my agent stepped in and said, "This is free work, and it's not worth it at this point. I think we need to move on and find either someone else who wants this book, or you need to work on something else." Because exhaustion is real too. At that point, I'd worked on the same project for about 3 years, and my agent very wisely said, "You're getting burned out, and I know that your potential is such that we can, bravely move on to something new." And I was really happy to have her step in at that point, because I was ready to kind of run myself into the ground. And she saw that and said, like, let's just take a breather and come back to it at another time. And that was really smart.
That's good. So it sounds like the overarching relationship that matters the most is the one that you have with your agent when you get to that point, so that your agent is the one who can help you to make the best decision about an R&R request.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They're clear-eyed, and excuse me, and they've seen this many more times than any of us. So they have
Yeah.
a 30,000 foot view of things, and we are so tied into our personal work that it can be very hard to get perspective. So that is definitely where your agent is very pivotal.
So if you have received an R&R request from an agent, in other words, I know some authors who have submitted work and an agent will come back and say, well, I'm interested, but I'd like to see if you can do this, that, or the other thing and make this, that, or the other change. What do you think is kind of are there guidelines, or do you have suggestions for how to make that decision, because authors can be very desperate, and sometimes agents, editors, and anyone in the publishing industry, just like any other industry, are not super ethical. So what's the best way to know whether that is a good decision for an author to try to make those changes to get the representation, and when is it time to say no thank you, I'm going to keep looking?
This is a great thing to talk about. First and foremost, it is so important, just like I said, it's important to frame an R&R as free work. It's important to, when you are seeking representation, to recognize that you have created something out of thin air. Writers are magical people. We create things that other people want, and we often spin that around in our own minds and think, oh, who is going to give me the gift of putting my work out into the world? And that is just a massive miscalculation of how this works. The power starts with us. We created this thing. We have worlds, and other people need to prove to us that they are the right people to help bring those worlds to other people. So I really implore everyone listening to keep in mind that power dynamic when they are moving forward with making professional decisions, because I think the other way of coming from a place of need, of want, of willing to do anything to have your work out in the world, that leads you to devalue yourself and to engage in relationships that are not fruitful for you, and to put up with relationships and treatment that is not acceptable. So going forward, thinking about who is the best person to be at my side while I bring my best work into the world, that's the way to move forward and think about it, I think. Um, and I wanted to make sure that I said that at first, and now I'm losing my train for the rest of it. We were agent R&R. Yes, that was it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And because the other thing I wanted to say is I had this experience in not the book that got me my agent, but the one before. I queried. I had a lovely agent be very interested and give me an R&R. I thought her notes were fantastic, so I went through the manuscript and implemented her notes. And then I sent the revised version back to her, and she ghosted me. I never heard back. So that was a really upsetting experience, but not an uncommon one, right? So I would say if you get notes from anyone and they just feel right, then of course, take those notes. That's your prerogative. Do what you would like with them. It's worth it. Most other R&Rs, I think, do get a response, are engaged with by the other party. But if someone wants you to do multiple rounds of R&R before they have signed you, before they have shown, I would be so hesitant about that. One R&R, and then either they're willing to sign you because they've seen that you can work hard, they've seen that you can revise, they've seen that your visions match, or it's time to move on to someone else. I think there's not a lot of benefit in being strung along for months or years on the hopes of one person signing you when you could be finding representation elsewhere, working with other people, and moving on in more constructive ways.
So that brings me to the most painful question of all, and that is, after the R&R requests, after the rejections or the waiting or however long it is, when is it time to pull the plug on a project, at least for the time being, and submit something new?
Yeah, this is such a hard one, and I've had to do it, and it can feel, you can feel very defeated sometimes by projects, but man, also sometimes letting go of a project feels like being set free. So be open to that possibility too. Sometimes a book only serves you to help get you to another place. So keep in mind that's always a possibility. When I was thinking about this question, it's a tough one because it's different for every author, of course. I would say often I've seen friends, if you're stuck and you can't get unstuck, if you're like a Jeep in the mud and the tires just keep flinging stuff back and you can't seem to get anywhere, even when you try different approaches or different styles of writing, or you switch up your routine, you just still can't move forward with it, at least take a month off and see where you come back to. At least give yourself a little mini vacation to think about other things or something like that. And if you just can't get unstuck, don't force it. I think there's something to be said for it. And you don't always have to think about leaving a project as abandoning it forever. You can say, what we like to say, put it in a drawer, right? Put it in a drawer. It'll be there. And if you feel the need to come back to it, trust that you will know when the right time for that is. The other thing I was thinking of is if you're sick of it. And by sick of it, I mean sick of the project itself and not the process. And those are two really different things. If you're sick of the process, then maybe it's time to try writing at night instead, or try writing on your phone for a little bit, or mixing up the process and how you go about. Maybe try outlining. There's a lot of different things you can do to kind of like reinvigorate your creative mind to tackle the project the way it deserves. But if you're sick of these characters, if you're sick of this book, if you're sick of this world, if you're sick of this setting, oh my gosh, life is too short. you know, I look back at the books that I've written and and I'm still not sick of any of them. I still love the people that are in those books. I still love the setting. I love what I was trying to say. I love the ideas that are in there. Man, sometimes I got sick of the process with it, and I got sick of being in the same thing and needed to move on and try something new to gain perspective. But if you are sick of the book itself, definitely move on because life is too short.
So you never want to talk to those people again, right?
Yeah,
it's time to let them go.
And this, right? I think we've all probably had relationships like that or friendships like that where it's like, sometimes books just serve you for who you are at that time and they don't need to follow you forever. So you don't have to pledge allegiance to any one project for the rest of your life. Please don't.
Excellent advice. So our time is about up, and I want to remind everyone that Sarah has the podcast, the First Draft podcast,
Yes.
which you can find. And Sarah, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about your website and any other places where people can find you and your book coming out in about a month. Exactly a month, actually, from today.
Exactly a month. It's not exciting. So Tell Me Everything comes out February 26th. The quick pitch for it is, what if Amelie had Instagram? So it's a contemporary YA, kind of a quirky one. If that sounds fun to you, you should check out more about it at sarahenni.com. And that sarahenni.com is where you can sign up for my newsletter and all that stuff. I'm at Sarah Enni on Twitter and Instagram. And the First Draft podcast has, as of today, 175 other episodes with writers who have gone through the gamut of all kinds of experiences. So if your listeners want to get a little bit more perspective, maybe maybe from some of their favorite YA writers, definitely go to firstdraftpod.com. You can look at the archives. I've talked to so many different people. There's so much to learn at the podcast. You can also sign up for the newsletter for the podcast and find it at First Draft Pod on Twitter and Instagram as well.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. A lot of information available. And I really appreciate your time today, Sarah.
Yeah, your questions were so good. And thank you for all that you're providing for the community. This is a huge resource. So I'm excited for it to be in the world.
Thank you.
Yay.